Really great to be here. Very nice to be invited to present some results, outcomes, harvest of our project, an ERC Consolidator grant that I did with a team of researchers. I was asked to say a few words about the research project Consolidator grant called Follow that I did with a team of colleagues. And what we try to do, I'll just very briefly say a few words about what the project was about. So the idea of the project, in a kind of STS fashion, was to follow the suspicious transaction. So the suspicious terrorist transaction. So the idea, especially after 9/11, is very much that you can find and stop and intercept and disrupt the terrorists by following the financial flows and interrupting and stopping the money. And in that context, in that policy landscape, the idea of the Follow project was that we could follow the suspicious transaction, which is something else. It's different from following the money. The question was, what is a suspicious transaction? Where does it come from? How is it identified? How do banks analyze their millions and billions of transaction flows every day to identify those transactions that are suspicious? How do they judge, deliberate the suspicious transaction? How do they carve it off? How do they send it somewhere else, which is the financial intelligence unit? How does the financial intelligence unit deal with the financial transaction? What do they do with it? Or put differently, what is the financial transaction, the suspicious financial transaction, able to do within a financial intelligence unit? How then does it travel to police, to prosecution, and what is it able to do in those environments? So that was the key idea, and the background to that idea was also that CFT, short for counterterrorism financing, is a crucial experimental site. So back to the experimental, although I don't think anyone would call it an experiment, but we conceptualize it as a crucial experimental site for new forms of algorithmic transaction analysis, new forms of public-private data sharing, new forms of preemptive criminal law, new developments actually that would be very difficult to affect in relation to any other type of societal problem, including money laundering, but that within terrorism financing become possible. For example, really transaction data sharing, really at the limits of law, is possible in the realm of terrorism financing in ways that it would not be possible if you would think about fighting tax avoidance, for example. So counterterrorism financing is this crucial site, like a canary in the coal mine, where things are happening that are not possible in other areas. And so our core question being, how does the suspicious transaction come into being? How is it handled, shared, translated across public-private spheres? How is it acted upon, and how does it act? We worked roughly between 2016 and 2022. There were 3 PhDs on the project, and then a few other people who became associated with the project, 2 postdoctoral researchers, 2 research assistants. And the question today that I've been asked to speak about, what are the results? What did we harvest? What were the outcomes? And partly we don't know. Outcomes are, I guess our outcomes or the things that we produced find their way in the world in ways that partly are beyond our vision and also will need a longer time to materialize. But I did have the question, define harvest. So what is a harvest in this sense? And then I thought about, well, if I look back now, what's the major thing that we did? What is a harvest? It's a period or a product of a crop, and that crop is something that nourishes, something that sustains. And actually, if I look back at the project now, one of the major things I hope we were able to do was to provide a nourishment or sustenance to actually not a generation because we were only few, but to a group of early career scholars who are now no longer early career, who are themselves mid-career. So looking back on the harvest, I would say that primarily the harvest is also in the collective, in the networks we were able to build, in the dialogues we were able to create, in the new research lines that we were able to develop together. So if I now think about some of the project researchers like Tasneem Anwar, who has gone on to the FU, who's doing a larger project concerning terrorism in the courts and also post-colonial readings of how terrorism related trials are coming before the courts, criminal courts. There's a whole almost like new research line emerging there that we developed also in dialogue within the team. Also Carola Westermeier, who went back to Frankfurt, thinking about her research lines. So in a way, thinking about these lines of agendas and connections and networks that came out of the project, but also new orientations to practice. So we did some practical work. We tried to be engaged and visible in some of the Dutch policy-related debate on terrorism financing in the Netherlands. And Esme Bosma and Pieter Lagewaard, for example, wrote a piece in het Financieel Dagblad, which is only a very short piece, but it got loads of exposure and it got loads of resonance in the field as well. And actually Esme ended up working at Deloitte. So not everybody stayed in academia. Some people chose different careers and something came out of that. And so I retrieved some photographs. Actually, I think in terms of harvesting our protest at the Malieveld a couple of years ago when it was protesting against budget cuts in education in the Netherlands. And it was interesting because it was across all levels of education. So my daughter came along because she was in primary school. So anyway, so I think some of that was the major harvest to do with the interpersonal connections and the collective. Having said that, we also did lots of other stuff, including the kinds of publications and outcomes that one would more traditionally think of as harvest or academic harvest or output. And one of the things we did was to edit this book, also with a number of people in the AISSR. So actually I see that Arella is here. She has a really nice chapter in this book. It was an edited volume. And it really came from the question, because when I went to the interview with the ERC, and not just the ERC, because I also was interviewed at NWO. Anyway, the main question that people had about the project was, yes, but what about access? Will you be able to access the bank? Will you be able to access the financial intelligence unit to get to this information? Will they let you in? And so in the team, we had lots of discussions about that. And we also had lots of discussions about what it means ethically, how much do we want to be inside the bank, what will it do with us if we are inside the bank, what happens when you get access to transactions analysis inside the bank, which actually we did get, and Esme spent like two months as an intern inside the bank, in a way getting more access than we wanted is a strange way to put it. But I do actually believe you can know too much. Like there's things you get to know on the inside of the institutions that you study, especially if you study security institutions or authoritative institutions, and that's actually what Arella's chapter is also about, where you get to see and know things that perhaps you wouldn't necessarily want to see and know because it requires or evokes certain types of ethical reflection. Anyway, we had a lot of discussions about these issues in the team, so many that we decided to edit a book about it. We had a really nice workshop, and then we edited this volume together with Esme, who was the PhD student, and Polly Pallister-Wilkins, who's a colleague in the politics department. And in the book, we think about secrecy and confidentiality beyond the binary of secret open or access no access. So with a bunch of other authors, we talk about being on the inside, being on the outside. What is the moment of access? Is that ever really a moment? And if you get access to an institution, does that mean that you get to see everything? Or is it still always a partial and a managed disclosure? And how do you relate yourself and your own positionality to that partial managed disclosure? What practices of obfuscation? So instead of secrecy has a sense of real deliberate withholding of information, but actually thinking about practices of obfuscation is more interesting because sometimes material is inaccessible, not because it is deliberately withheld, but because organizations are short of staff, or they have other things to do, or they forget about your email, or the material isn't exactly classified, but they're not super keen to share it either. So there's lots of practices of obfuscation at work. One of the questions that I thought was really interesting was the question, what is secret to the research subjects themselves? Like, what do they find most secret and sensitive, and why? And that wasn't always necessarily the thing that I, as a researcher, was most interested in, but it tells me something about the practices of that actor to know why they are particularly protective of a certain piece of information or aspect of their work. Whereas other things, you know, there were also examples of things that were shared with us that I thought was really sensitive, but that practitioners felt much less possessive about. And then the book is also about creative tools, both of having access and working with leaked materials. There's a really nice chapter of people who worked with materials from WikiLeaks, and some journals in the US won't publish leaked materials. Anyway, and there are some, and we started thinking about writing with secrecy. So how do you incorporate those absences and those secrets into your written academic work? So that's one of the things we did, that we harvested, that I'm really pleased with, also in retrospect, and hopefully it is useful to others as well. The book is open access. So that's one example of what we did. And then if there's enough time left, I want to briefly talk about another example, which is this paper that only just recently came out. I wrote it with Carola. And the funny thing was, we started looking very everyday, focused way at the suspicious transaction, which seems like a very micro focus if you want to use the language of micro and macro, which we didn't in the project because it was more STS inspired. But we ended up going from the, I guess, particular of the suspicious transaction back to the general of geopolitics, if you will, because we looked at the way that SWIFT transactions, SWIFT being, you know, the network that facilitates interbank communication. You all know it because you have your SWIFT and your IBAN numbers. Otherwise, you wouldn't really be able to have a practical life in this type of society. And SWIFT was so data from SWIFT were captured, shared, analyzed in the context of counterterrorism immediately after 9/11. And SWIFT sort of became really at the forefront of counterterrorism financing, and also what I would call an infrastructural anchor for US security sanctions. So SWIFT is now very much a way in which the US is forcing their security sanctions and their security decisions upon the world, because everybody who transacts in dollars, and that is actually almost everybody, will have to abide by US security sanctions through the dollar hegemony that is inscribed in SWIFT. It's a bit of a detailed, complex story, but I think the key takeaway is to think about SWIFT as having become this infrastructural anchor of security practices and counterterrorism practices. And so in this article, we take an infrastructural perspective, looking at how sedimented financial infrastructures are a way or a site where power relations and geopolitical power relations become hardwired and become inscribed, and how that can subsequently then be subject again to repoliticization. So SWIFT was very much a technical, neutral payment network, or perceived as such, since the Bretton Woods era. But with its sort of anchoring of these financial security practices, you see slowly that the work of SWIFT and the network of SWIFT becomes politicized, becomes subject to political debate, becomes discussed in parliaments as well. Questions are raised about it. And actually now you see initiatives both by the European Union, but also, for example, by the Chinese, to set up non-dollar denominated international financial networks like Instex. Which is something set up by the EU in order to enable trade with Iran, because current security sanctions make it impossible to trade with Iran, and there's no way around that. So even if a French oil company wants to deal with Iran, and the transactions don't even go through the US, and then still through SWIFT, that would be made impossible in a practical sense. It's quite a detailed, complex story, but I just wanted to sort of highlight this also as one of the harvests that we, that I now look back on as one of the outcomes of our project, also because the whole infrastructural geopolitics is now again such a important topic, and we write about financial transactions and financial messaging infrastructure, but the sort of infrastructural geopolitics lens, I think, is very current now, unfortunately, in relation to what's going on in relation to, for example, the oil pipelines and the oil trading. So those are just a couple of things I want to highlight from our project. We did lots of other things as well, but these are just a few things to share. Our website is still up, so there are also more information about what we did and what came out of the project. And I look forward to hearing some questions from Ewald.
Marieke. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation about a very important project which basically pursued what could be seen as a very classical academic social scientific endeavor, disclosing the undisclosed, because that's basically what you've done. And we're all, one way or the other, connected to this global financial infrastructure, but most of us simply use it and don't pose any further questions. And it's, of course, an obvious task of a social scientist to do that very task, pose those further questions. So I want to, first of all, pursue what you said about gaining access a bit further, because what you actually seem to have been doing is something that could be called an anthropology of elites, or an anthropology of an undisclosed infrastructure, which one way or the other is connected to global finance and is managed, maintained, or peopled by highly educated, academically trained, well-paid professionals. And as such, they're not very welcoming to outsiders, one way or the other, tracing what they're doing. So, because you already said a lot about that, perhaps you can give us a little bit more in terms of the specifics, how you do that. And I have in mind, for instance, examples like the work done by the economic sociologist Brooke Harrington, who investigated private banking, again banking, finance, but also private, catering to the extreme rich. And she did that by simply taking up a job at a Swiss-based private bank. And that sort of indicates that you have to talk the talk, you have to be convincing, you have to actually become a little bit like an academic spy, and then not the sort of glamorous James Bond type of spy, but more the sort of humdrum George Smiley type of spy. But still, it requires clothing, it requires talk, it requires a particular type of ethos. You have to fit in one way or the other. Mm-hmm. So how did you do that?
Well, I don't agree with this metaphor of the spy at all. But I will get there. But first to say, there is the sense that the financial infrastructures that I talked about are in the background, are invisible. But if anyone in this room has tried to transact with certain conflict areas, Pakistan, Somalia, Iran, it's actually
Russia.
Impossible to transact. So I think there are people in this room, but also during the time that we think that SWIFT was completely unpoliticized, for whom it was always political, and for whom that sort of seamless, every day in the background transacting that we in privileged places or in the West are used to has never been reality. And so increasingly, depending on where you need to transact your money in and out of, there are people who are facing delays, freezing, obstacles, incomprehensible decisions by their banks, months and months and months of the money arriving, and so on. And so that depends a little bit on what perspective you start from to think that these infrastructures were in the background in the first place. Then secondly, your question is about access and this sense of how to connect to the elites. And yes, I think absolutely there is a certain way of connecting, networking, dressing in order to establish these relations. And part of the relations that we had and that we were able to capitalize on, to use that metaphor, was because I had previously done some work, and I had also previously been visible in a very, very small way in the debate in the Netherlands about counterterrorism financing. So I had a few connections with the bank. But the premise of our project was very much to operate and start without a normative judgment, to really look at the object. What is this practice? What is the suspicious financial transaction? How do you arrive at it? And going into that field or institution without a preset normative judgment of whether these people were elites or whether these people were ultimately the power holders, I think was an interesting thing to do, because what we found is that there are many people let's say, inside the field of practice who themselves are the best critical voices of the practice. And especially if you go inside the banks, not the Dutch central bank, because they are the worst. But if you go inside the commercial banks, you will find many people, you call them elites, and perhaps, they have, I don't know if they have secure jobs, because anyway, if you look at some of the ethnography on the banking world, you know that perhaps some people are high paid, but they're always like at the edge of their seat because they could be out with the next reorganization. But anyway, what we tried to do with this approach of going in without normative judgment was to connect to and in a way amplify and build on the voices of critique that are inside the practices. And those voices of critique are actually pretty strong, except they can hardly ever be voiced publicly. But they're very strong and knowledgeable because they know the practices much better than we do. So they also know very well what's wrong with the practices. And we heard also from people inside banks that in the absence of reliable indicators of what terrorism financing looks like, actually they end up working with really crude things like relationships to non-governmental organizations that could be vaguely classified as Muslim faith-based. And bankers will acknowledge that to you, and they are not happy with it. So I think the critique inside the practice is really strong and not to be dismissed outright.
Let me pursue that a little bit further, and that has to do with the way in which you introduced the project just now. You indicated that it was work done in the tradition of STS, Science and Technology Studies. I know you a little bit longer, and I sort of recollect that we first met during workshops, which one way or the other belonged to a field which could be called critical finance studies. And perhaps you already sort of see where I'm sort of hinting at. Science and Technology Studies as such tries to remain normatively spoken at the surface of the practices that they're investigating, whereas critical finance studies is much stronger involved in coming up with a critique of financialized capitalism. And in your PhD thesis, you did a wonderful chapter, again, if I recollect correctly, where you were interested in sort of the drawing of the legal boundary between speculation and investment. You could, of course, have done the same with regards to whether or not a transaction is suspicious, because that too is, in a sense, something which is related to legal or administrative boundaries. And of course, with regard to these suspicious financial transactions, there is, of course, a whole narrative to be told about anti-American imperialism, which one way or the other could feed a different sort of assessment of what is suspicious. But you apparently explicitly chose not to do so. Could you perhaps expand a little bit on that?
Well, in terms of the conceptual background, I just mentioned offhand STS, but I'm not sure that that really captures. Okay. I think a lot of the conceptual framework was also developed in dialogue with Annemarie Mol, who is here. And I don't want to blame her for any of the things that went wrong. She's not to be held accountable of the butcher job we made of our conceptual framework ultimately. But I think really some of the key ingredients of going into the field without a normative judgment, some of the key ingredient of really following the practice, the curiosity towards the practices of the professionals, and also suspending judgment in order to understand what professionals are doing and how they explain it on their terms. That's not to say that ultimately you don't arrive at a critique, but your critique is not already known at the outset, knowing that my critique is a critique of financial capitalism. I don't know. I need to observe the practice in order to find the lines of critique that are actually articulated, I think, very well inside the practice, but then to amplify them, make them visible, make them accelerate or have another life in another public dimension, I guess. So some of those, so that's perhaps not very clear, but we worked, I very much started also with the Latourian framework because Latour is this really great example of how the fact is made, and he follows the chain of translation from the Amazonian soil in Pandora's Hope, right? Where he follows the scientists who go to the Amazon, they collect the soil, they transport it on the boats, they carve it off, they label it, they put it in boxes, and then they bring it to, the former colonial center, which is Paris, where it becomes, part of scientific research, and then it ends up as a scientific fact. And he follows this chain of translation of how a scientific fact is established in practice. And that's what we try to do with the suspicious transaction, to sort of follow how it is carved off, how it is shared, how it is interpreted, how it is rendered, and how it is made factual in a way. So that's where I would say when I said STS inspired, I think those are the lines of inspiration. Is really the chain of translation and also the practical ethics dimensions. I do think a lot of our work is a critique of what ends, and the critique being how do certain transactions become labeled as suspicious? How does that happen? How does that attach to certain types of transactions and transactional groups and not others? And I think sort of unpacking that and rendering that visible is a type of critique. But it's not a critique that is super sure of itself. It's set up in the sense of knowing, well, the financial capitalists did it.
Well, thank you very much. No further questions?
I know you have more, but they have to wait until...
No, sure, yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, very interesting.